I heard in a interview that you had that we created the idea of God. What do you mean by that?
Well, just um, the belief that when people say they believe in God, well, what do they mean by that, and how do they know that that's true? And my contention is it's more likely that humans created God as a concept rather than that God created us or God created the universe or whatever.
Interesting. What you probably heard this before, but would it be a fair thing to say that our acknowledgement of God doesn't validate his existence? Meaning, like, I don't know, if there was some sort of an animal that we've only seen by pictures and it was located in Africa, and we said, well, you know, for a lack of better analogy, well, I choose not to believe in it, but it doesn't, despite the fact that it still may be true, whether or not we believe. If you
Sure.
get what I'm
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah. Yeah. There could be a God. But again, I guess it depends what you mean by that. What do you mean? Let's start there. What do you mean by God?
a creator, a divine nature,
Okay.
and I would say that for the basis of God.
So something like a supernatural being or omniscient, omnipotent being.
Yes,
Yeah. Outside of space and time
outside of space
or
and time.
outside of our universe. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, okay. If it's supernatural, outside of space and time and so on, how would we possibly know whether this entity exists or not?
Well, I think.
Because our senses are geared for we live in this world.
Well, don't you think?
And
Don't you think the opposite could be said? Well, if we live in this world, how could we say, like, or come to the realization of how this world was created? And plain, like,
well, so you're asking a slightly different question. You're asking where did all this stuff come from? Why is there something
which
rather
is
than
the root,
nothing?
which is like the root of like all the basis of like everything is that, like the beginning of everything.
Yeah. So you're asking. We want we would like an explanation for where the universe came from, why there's something rather than nothing, why the universe is structured the way it is, the origins of life and consciousness, and so on. Yeah, those are all great questions. The God hypothesis is one, but there are other hypotheses
Hmm.
that are actually testable. That is to say, based in physics and cosmology and so forth. At some point, although theists have arguments for God's existence, the first cause, prime mover, the fine tunedness of the universe, and so on, the cosmological argument. Scientists have equally good counter arguments. And so, in my opinion, it sort of comes down to faith.
Hmm.
That is, are you willing to just believe even though you can't prove it? Because it's a more satisfactory answer that the universe came from a creator rather than that it came about through natural forces. And of course, at this point, though, I would say, well, where did the creator come from? To which you would answer, what?
I guess that is a valid point. But if we are talking about a creator that is what you said outside of space and time, he wouldn't need a creator. He would be the ultimate creator, which I guess you kind of can go. I can see where you're going. My thing is, like, don't both require faith, because science has yet to prove the starting point of this, or has answers unanswered, or questions unanswered, and equally so does faith in God. So don't both require faith to a certain extent.
Well, no, because with science, if we hit an epistemological wall,
Hmm.
we just say, I don't know. We don't know. There are some answers to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? I discuss these in my books.
Yeah.
But if you're not satisfied with those, it's also okay to just say, I don't know. Nobody actually knows.
Yeah.
And therefore we could just leave it at that, just full stop. Why go one more step and say, well, there was a creative force, an agent of some sort, a deity? Well, okay, but where did the deity come from? Well, we don't need an explanation for that. Well, then why do you need an explanation for the universe? Why can't we just say the universe has always existed? And that the Big Bang was just one of many creation events, and there's always been creation events. And any entity, if, the moment you make an argument that something exists, so that means it had to come into existence. Therefore, there must have been a creative moment. What was behind the creative moment? Why can't we apply that argument to God?
Well, that is true. That's
Right?
I
And
I
so
could
again,
see. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, I guess yeah, I guess one thing that I'm realizing in my youth and talking to more individuals like yourself, is realizing that there will always be questions unanswered, and I think whether or not you choose to believe in God, in Jesus, in science, in there's all requires faith to a certain extent. But something that, when I watch back in your interviews and read some of your books, I I haven't heard you talk into depth about this, but is you not believing in the existence of God more so come from the overwhelming evidence that there is not a God? Or is it also, you had a personal experience growing up with religion, with church that made you get a distaste of religion, if that makes sense?
Oh, well, I've written about this in my book, The Believing Brain, that I was not raised religious at all. My parents were, they were neither pro religion nor anti religion. They just, didn't come up much.
Mm-hmm.
They dropped me off at Sunday school a few times out of obligatory. No, but I became an evangelical born again Christian in high school in my senior year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I carried that forward into college. I went to Pepperdine University, which is a Church of Christ school. And I was an evangelical for about 7 years, well into graduate school.
Wow.
And then I just kind of lost my faith, not overnight. There were a number of events. First, I kind of reviewed all the arguments for God's existence. And of course, since I was a Christian, that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened literally and all that. But then in college, I took courses in comparative world religions and anthropology of religions and mythology and all that Joseph Campbell stuff was going on at the time. And I was just kind of noticing that people around the world believe lots of different things, and each of them believes that their religion is the one true religion. Well, what makes me think mine was right? What are the chances I happen to get it right just because I'm me? There's nothing special about me or Christianity. So what, why should they be right? If you were an anthropologist from Mars and you had sitting before you a couple dozen different leaders of religions, each of whom said ours is the one true religion, how would you distinguish which is the right one? Because they're often contradictory of one another. Anyway, that kind of line of reasoning bothered me. The problem of evil was also troubling. Why do bad things happen to good people? If God is all powerful and all knowing and all loving, why does he allow childhood leukemia, for example, and the suffering, horrible suffering of children and their parents who love them? And it's just terrible. Why does that happen? There are answers to this. I don't find them particularly satisfying. But so I'll add all that up, and then I just kind of quietly gave it up. I just thought, you know what, I just don't really think the arguments are that good. They're okay, but scientists have good counter arguments, and it sort of goes back and forth, back and forth. And to me, I just said, you know what, I just think the chances of there actually being a god are less than the idea that we probably just made him up as an explanation for where everything came from.
So it's more so just you had questions that couldn't be answered, or you didn't like the answers that were given, versus, you had a personal experience where, I don't know, maybe a church leader got caught doing something. Like it was more so,
No, well, all those things are troubling, of course, the
yeah.
priestly pedophilia problem and all that. But that I don't. That's a problem with religion, not a theist argument or an atheist argument. I just don't think the arguments are that good. They're okay. The origins of the universe and why is there something rather than nothing, fine tuning and so on. They're okay. They're good arguments. If you already believe in God, then you can tack those on as reasons, additional reasons to believe. But I think it just ultimately comes down to, I don't know, but just whatever works for you and a more sort of a pragmatic truth. And I just don't need it. I don't. There's no reason to believe it. I mean, just say, let's just say, just analogously, we discovered an extraterrestrial intelligence that was just vastly superior to us, just
Mhm.
a million years more advanced than us. It would be essentially an omniscient, omnipotent being. Given what we've been able to accomplish with just a few centuries of science and technology and genetic engineering and computers and so on. Imagine what an intelligence a million years more advanced than us would be able to do. That would seem to us like a god, like an omniscient, omnipotent being. And yet we would know that, well, but it's just a natural being that evolved on some other planet. At some point, if you enter what you're proposing,
Mhm.
how do you know there's this force outside of the universe, not aliens, but an actual supernatural being? And what I'm claiming is that you can't prove that,
Yeah.
and I can't prove that it's not true. Um, and so I'm not claiming I'm not a strong atheist in the sense that I know there is no God. I don't know that. I could be wrong. I'm happy to be proven wrong. I guess maybe I'll find out in the next life, or maybe not. But that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah. The reason why I asked that, and you'll see where I'm getting to with this, is that, when you look at, us Christians, right? The mission is, well, make disciples of all nations, and so you proclaim that. And the reason you proclaim that is because what you believe. If you believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, that He's the way, the truth, and the life, then the people that don't believe in Him, or the people that have never heard about Him, our job is to make that known. And then when you don't believe in God, and to not be an activist for atheism, but to talk about, the denial or the unexistence of God, like, what's the mission behind that, if that makes sense? Like, what's the mission for you? Is it that you think that religion is dangerous to a society? Is it that you just believe that people are brainwashed and that this is never going to lead anywhere? Like, what's the mission, if that makes sense?
Well, that's a different question. You're asking about is religion a force for good or bad in society and so on. And, it's a complex uh, question because for some people, religion is really helpful and it's good. It makes their lives better. Okay, fine. Whatever it takes to get you through the night. Life is hard. Is it better for society if we all believe? Well, I don't think you can make that argument.
Yeah.
Most of the good things that we think of in society came not from religion at all, actually, in spite of religion. I wrote a book about this called The Moral Arc. Centuries of moral progress, civil rights, the abolition of slavery and torture, women's rights, gay rights, animal rights, workers' rights, children's rights, and so on. Those all came about through secular arguments and forces and activists. Sometimes religions got on board, like in the case of the abolition of slavery. There, some of the Quakers, some of the some Episcopalians like Wilberforce, who was an activist for the abolition of slavery in England. Yeah, but their primary opponents were Christians. I mean, the primary leaders of the slavery is good argument were Christians. They made centuries of argument. You can read their sermons, you can read their speeches, you can read their documents and books. It's right there in the Old Testament. Slavery is totally natural. This is the way God made it. The brown people are on this continent and they're meant to be slaves. Otherwise, they would be uncivilized. We're saving their souls through Christianity. We're giving them a better life than they would have had as non-slaves, and so on and so on. You can read all this stuff in the 19th century American justifications of slavery before the Civil War. After the Civil War, eventually Christians got on board with this. What, slavery was probably a bad idea, but there was no new revelation from God. Like, hey, the prophet just heard the voice of God and he said, slavery is a bad idea. That never happened. And same thing with civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. Religion, you can track this through polling agencies like Pew and Gallup that have been asking Americans since the 1960s, actually since the 1950s, about their attitudes toward blacks and Jews and women and gays and so on. And it's always the most religious people who are the most critical of the activists who are, lobbying for equal rights and equal treatment under the law. Once the moral revolution happens, then religions get on board. So Christians today, thank goodness, are totally against slavery and totally in favor of civil rights for all Americans, totally in favor of equality for women, and in same-sex marriage. That was almost all Americans. The majority of Americans opposed it as late as 2011. Even Hillary and Barack Obama opposed it. And then in 2015, the Supreme Court decision made it the law of the land. And that same-sex marriage, gay people have the same rights as everybody else under the Constitution. Therefore, they should be treated equally. And you'll notice that very few Christians today ever even mention it anymore. They just dropped it as a cause. Now most polls show that Christians now accept gays as being equally dignified and treated equally under the law, and of same moral standing and so on. So that's another example of those forces don't happen because of religion, but in spite of it, and then religions get on board.
Question: were these polls and these numbers showing this for the social issues, whether it's racism or slavery or what? How was this taken? Like, because I also don't want a general assumption to be made, and maybe it was like a smaller polling. Like, how was the polling done?
Well, the Pew and Gallup, they survey usually about between 1,000 and 3,000 people randomly chosen from each state in the union and
Mm.
different age brackets and so on. This is all done by professional pollsters. I have my own polling agency, the Skeptic Research Center. We do this. It costs a lot of money. It
Yeah,
costs me tens of thousands of dollars to do a poll. I get three. Usually, I go for 3,000 people to make sure it's representative. So, most of those polls are fairly trustworthy. And you can break them down. People in the South are different from people in the North, or people from this state are different from people in that state. And if you look at Pew and Gallup and Barna, for example, is a religious pollster, and Barna is a Christian religious polling agency, and yet they still find that pretty much the same things that Pew and Gallup, who are secular, not religious, find. So that tells me their data is probably pretty solid.
interesting. So, okay, that makes sense. Now I
Yeah.
know. So it's not. So I'm assuming not to get too into the details of it, but the way that it's done is like you take like a specific location with a specific demographic of a person, whether it be Christian or anything, and then you send it to X amount of people, and not
Yes.
everybody are set up like.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is done. It used to be done through the mail. Now it's done through email and also through phone calls.
Mm.
Although fewer people have landlines anymore. So the technology of the data collection has changed as the technology of communication changes. But the polling agencies are considered to be pretty reliable. Yeah, that's not the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't even need that. You just look back at the writings of religious people and secular people in the 1950s and 60s and so on. Everybody's moral sphere has expanded to include more people. And that I am claiming in the moral arc is due largely to Enlightenment values that have spread throughout Western culture, that everybody deserves equal treatment under the law, equal dignity, and equal moral standing. That did not used to be the case. I mean, if you and I had this conversation, I don't know, 2 centuries ago, we probably would have been talking about why slavery is justified. I can't say that I'm a particularly advanced moral person because I'm against slavery. Everybody's against slavery now. It's meaningless to say you're against slavery. Of
Yeah.
course, everybody is. But would you have been 2 centuries ago? I don't know. Maybe not.
Interesting. Do you think maybe science and religion are not too far off in the sense that maybe religion can help bridge a gap for science and questions that haven't been answered, or vice versa, that science can't prove religion, like in this? Because again, the big question that people will always have is, how did we get here? What's the origin story? Does God? Do you think maybe that religion and science kind of are intertwined in a way?
Well, some people make that argument. I tend to think that uh, we offer different explanations for the hard problems. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah.
Why this particular universe? The origins of morality and consciousness, the origins of life, the origins of complex life, and so on. Those are the big ones. Free will and determinism is another one. And the explanations vary in quality. Some are better than others. If you just look at the hard problem of consciousness, you just look it up in Wikipedia. There's a dozen different theories. None of them religious. Just neuroscientists attempting to answer the question. But some of them are better than others, and so I would say theistic arguments or answers to these questions, they're okay, but they're not as good as I think the scientific explanations, even if the scientific explanations are wrong or they're not complete. And I would say that they're not complete. I would say that those biggest questions I just mentioned, I think we're a ways from answering them fully to the satisfaction of most people. And it's just because they're hard problems. Science is fairly new. There's a lot we're still discovering about the universe and physics, and we still don't have a unified theory to kind of link general relativity that explains the macrocosms of the universe, and quantum physics, which describes the sort of micro subatomic physics. We still don't have an explanation for that. So until we do, we may be left with some of these unanswered questions, and that's okay. I mean, so that's what my point is. That it sort of comes down to: are you okay just saying I don't know, or do you really need an explanation? And God fills that need. Okay, but I don't need it. And so if you want to believe in God, okay, I'm not trying to talk you out of it, but don't insist that everybody else should also believe in your particular religion. I gather you're a Christian.
Yeah.
So fine, good for you, but not. I don't need it.
Question: do you think we would ever get to the point where science has an answer to the creation of the universe?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, no, I mean we have some good explanations already of why something comes from nothing, and why the universe is tuned the way it is, why the parameters and laws of physics are the way they are. I mean, there's entire books written about this, and but they're not. There's not general consensus among scientists. Yes, that's the explanation. There's much debate, even among scientists who are not religious, or maybe they are, but they don't invoke religion as an explanation because it's not a very good one. They're not in agreement of what's the best explanation. So, again, just say, these are big, hard questions. Here's some answers. Here's some explanations. We're not sure. So let's just kind of leave it at that and keep searching. That should also be on the table.
Yeah, and it kind of goes to a point that I wanted to make, which I believe is really important. That I think whatever you claim to believe, a healthy level of skepticism should be had, right? A level to where if you're a Christian, I think the problem comes when you blindly trust everything without questioning, without reading, without getting the other side of things. Seeing what Islam has to say, seeing what atheists have to say, seeing what, and kind of, and I think in that you get closer to the truth, because I think there is. Maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's an absolute truth out there. I would like to believe so, but the point is, do you think a healthy level of skepticism should be had, whether you are religious or you're not?
Well, the name of my magazine is Skeptic.
Yep.
So yeah, I think a healthy level of skepticism is good on everybody's part. And so yeah, good for you. You're talking to me. You're asking hard questions of yourself. That's good. But let me ask you something. Why are you a Christian and not, say, a Muslim or a Jew?
I'll give you my three reasons as to it. And I'm still, mind you, I'm 19, so I'm still learning along the way. So I leave. That's why I leave open minded. I say, well, I'm
Yeah,
still
it's
learning a
okay.
lot.
Good. Yeah.
But as of what I know right now, and the people I've talked to, I would say it's three main reasons. I would say the life of Jesus, right? The disciples, and then I would say my own personal experience walking with Christ. And I'll say the reason for Jesus is because, at least what I've seen so far, the podcasts I've heard, some of websites I've seen of old manuscripts and a bunch of different stuff, and the existence of a man by the name of Jesus 2,000 years ago existed. Like most people agree with that Jesus existed as a man. Now, where obviously people can differ if he is who he says he was, if he was just a political activist, was he here just because of the Roman Empire and he was maybe a political activist, was he really God? Was So then you look at his words, right? And then the next point that I would say, reading his word and reading a couple of different books, you kind of see that again. Not only is there evidence pointing to the life of Christ, but that he died, and then the resurrection. I mean, you can leave it up to faith, but there's also, and I hate to say because maybe it's not the best explanation, but in the Bible it says there was 500 witnesses, and I'm sure there's something online that kind of proves of evidence outside of the Bible, which is another reason as to why I believe in Jesus. And then the second part was the disciples, which that's evidence outside of the Bible that they all died very gruesome deaths. And it would just lead me to think like, okay, if you're somebody who claims this guy 2,000 years ago to be Lord and to be the Messiah, to be, the savior of the world, and you have the opportunity when you're about to be brutally murdered, you have the option to denounce him to stay alive. What does that say that you chose to die instead? Because you had the option to say, well, no, I don't believe in him, and you could just live. So there, and especially when there's no incentive. I mean, they didn't live rich lives. There was no incentive, at least not from my understanding as of now. So it kind of leads me to believe, well, why would they die? And that question leads to, well, maybe he was who he said he was. And then the third thing is, you know, I believe that I do walk with Christ, and I've seen a lot of miracles in my life happen, and I've seen a lot of miracles in the lives of people around me. And I think when there's an overwhelming amount of miracles in not only in my lives but the lives around me, it would also be foolish to say, well, no, that's all BS because God doesn't exist. I don't know if that's a valid theory. I'm open-minded to, suggestions, but
All right,
that's the three
let's look at
reasons.
those. But give me an example of some miracles you've witnessed.
Just to sum it up, yeah, started this, didn't have any reasoning as to why I should be doing this, didn't have any leads for my business, didn't have anything. And then a week later, a lot of miraculous things happened where a lot of people out of nowhere said, hey, I have this person that needs help with this. I kid you not, I didn't ask them, I didn't. And it was kind of like, I couldn't explain it. And so my explanation to it was God because of, you know, the decision that I made a week later. And I'll say for my life. And yeah, that's what I would say for my life. Other lives, I don't.
Oh, is it your belief that the deity who created the universe reached into the earthly affairs here and arranged for you to get some business deals?
Um,
Made that happen?
I would say that there was some sort of intervention because
And if you lost your job, would that be God's fault?
no, I wouldn't say it's God's fault. I would say it's a part of His plan. I wouldn't say it's so much His fault, and would say, oh, well, why God? Why did you do this? Which I think we could say that a lot of times when bad things happen and automatically point to this being God. But why did you? But He does allow bad things to happen. I would believe so.
But my point is this: that
Yes.
there's a million things that happen every day. People get jobs, they lose jobs. Just this stuff happens. You make connections, you don't make connections. This happens, that happens. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. It's just mostly random. So to take the good things that happen and go, oh, I think God made that happen for me. Thank you. I got the parking spot. I got the job. I met the love of my life at this party. I'm going to give God credit for that. Well, my answer is you don't need God to explain that. Just randomness. I mean, just stuff happens. And my point is that other things that are not so good will also happen to you. And are you going to, well, you don't have to blame God, but you just said, he's got a bigger plan. Well, okay. But what's the difference between just random things happen, some good, some bad, and that a deity is behind it all? And I don't see any difference. I mean, to me, it just looks, the whole thing could just be, God has nothing to do with it. It's just life is just a lot of
Well,
things going on. Or maybe you
yeah.
made it happen. Maybe you made it
Well,
happen by thinking
maybe I'm
positive.
always maybe I could look back and say, I made it happen. I guess this is my reasoning for, it, and you could. I'm open. Like I said, I enjoy hearing what you're saying because the reason I say this is because there's some things that are out of my control. I mean, this is somebody that I didn't reach out to. This is somebody I didn't communicate with. This is somebody that I haven't spoken to, and then randomly the week after they reach out to me saying, "Hey, look, I don't know if you could help out with this." Yes, you could credit that to randomness, but I would credit that to God, and I think if in doing so, you kind of have, and maybe you can never prove 100%, and I think that's the reasoning for faith. You can never prove 100%. I just choose to take the latter of saying, you know what, God had some intervention in this, and equally so, I would say in the bad things, I would credit to Him as well, because if I believe, and I do, in a God that is outside of space and time, that means He knows to a certain extent. He's not a dictator. We have free will. He knows somewhat what the future will look like, or I think fully He will know what the future will look like. And if something may look bad right now, and you can even take this perspective from an outside religious point of view, like if you give a car to a 10-year-old, but obviously they're not of the legal age, or they would probably crash and they'll probably kill themselves. it wouldn't you wouldn't blame your parents at that age for saying, well, why didn't you let me have a car? And what? Because they understood in loving what they were doing. And in the same way, God can work in our lives when bad things happen that, hey, maybe you just don't understand that you're not ready for it now. And if you did have it right now, if I did have 1 million followers right now, I'd probably go around doing God knows what, but I don't have that because I don't know if that's a fair assessment of
Yeah,
that.
how come you don't have 1 million followers? What? How come God is, withholding those followers from you?
Well,
Well,
I
Jacob,
don't think
look,
he's with it's there. It's there.
look,
But
Jacob.
yes,
There's 8 billion people in the world. Every single day, every
yes.
one of them has 100 things that happens to them. Is it your belief that God is like intervening and active and busy every day with all 8 billion people? Not to mention whatever else is going on in the world.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
I mean if again, like it's going back to what we said, if I believe in an omnipresent Lord, then he has to, because then that will go contradictory to his nature, if that makes
I
sense,
see.
right?
Okay. And what would falsify this for you? What would it take to, I don't know, change your mind or put it to the test?
That God isn't real, or is that he's not working in everybody's life?
Yeah, that just the intervening and like, does he intervene in people's cancers or not? I mean, you have 2 billion Christians in the world. Some significant percentage of them get cancer, and a
Yeah.
lot of those cancers are deadly. Some of them, the cancers go into remission, and some of them, the people just die. And so, is it your contention that God is involved in all those cancers, and He just says, "Well, you get to live, and you don't. I have a bigger plan. You don't know what it is, but I do." Is that what you think is going on, or
So this is what I would say to him. I don't know. I don't know, and I don't think science knows either. I think science, and I heard you say this on a podcast, which I highly respected, is that science doesn't know, but at least they have the answer to cure the disease, which I agree with that fully. What I would say is this, and that's one of the questions, that I have, that I probably will have for the rest of my life. Well, like what you said, if God is all loving, all knowing, and hearing in everybody's life, why does He allow bad things to happen to kids in Siberia or Syria right now getting beheaded? Why does He allow people over, in
and what is your answer to that particular example?
but I don't know, and I don't have the answer to it.
Okay.
But
All right. Let's
and
go
I
to
would
some of your
say,
other. Let's turn to
well,
some of your other arguments.
I would
The
say,
dis-
well,
uh,
just to finish
oh
this
yeah.
thought,
Go ahead.
because
Sure.
I
Yeah.
I want to see what you would say to this, because I don't know the answer, and I don't think science would know the answer to that. But let's say for the cancer situation, to stick on that, would it be, again, you go to somebody that's dying of cancer, would it be wrong to give them a faith that, and maybe that faith, even if God doesn't exist, but even if their faith alone was like, oh, well, God is watching over me, maybe He can provide a way out. Wouldn't that, even if God isn't real, that faith alone be somewhat of like a motivator in that, you know, maybe
You
it
mean there
motivates
might
them
be
to
a
think,
placebo effect or something?
I guess so, for lack of better words. And also, like, if someone is dying of cancer, is it more hopeful to say, well, you're dying, like your life, just you're just gonna poof away, or saying, what, maybe there's an afterlife, kind of explaining to them. Again, whether or not it's true, I think those are the things that I would say to that. But again, I don't know. I'm learning to
You're learning,
the
yes.
the
Well, some of this
answer,
has been put to the test. I mean, do religious people heal faster, or are they more like, or let's say, prayed for religious people? Well, this was put to the test. It was a big Harvard study by Herbert Benson, funded by the Templeton Foundation, who supports these kinds of things. That does a prayer and healing study. That is, did the prayed for group get better any faster than the non-prayed for group? In the control group and so on. And the answer was no. There was no difference at all. And deeply religious people who get prayed for, they die from cancer, and some of them get better. Some of the people that were not prayed for, who are atheists, they get better from cancer. Sometimes they die from cancer. There's no difference, right? So what I'm saying is, how would you know? We got to put it to the test somehow. And where's your control group? If you don't know, then you're just hand waving. You're just saying, I just want to believe that God is involved in everything, and no matter what happens, I'm going to say God was behind it. So when good things happen, God made that happen. When bad things happen, He allowed it to happen because He's got a bigger plan. All right. Well, what would falsify that claim? And your answer is nothing.
Well, I wouldn't say. I would say I'm open to it. I genuinely like. I just don't know what would falsify that, and I also think it would be naive, kind of to what you were saying. If somebody were to tell me something right away, say, "Oh, you know what? You're right. I don't believe in God anymore." Then what type of faith is that? Then that in itself would show that it wasn't genuine. But I would say that I'm open to understanding these answers a little bit more. That
All right,
that's that's
let's
a
turn to the
my answer.
other arguments you made. The disciples going to their death and so on. Well, do you know who Mohammed Atta was? The Muslim flying the American airline jet that flew into
Hmm.
the World Trade Center building,
Yeah.
screaming, Allahu Akbar.
Hmm.
These are disciples, as it were, of Muhammad who absolutely believe just as strongly in Islam as you believe in Christianity.
Hmm.
And they go to their deaths regularly. Suicide bombers are very common in the last 50 years or so. And what is your explanation for that? I mean, does that mean
I
Islam is the one true faith? And because
Well,
look,
no,
the disciples.
I would say there's two vastly differences in both scenarios. One is voluntarily and one is involuntary, right? One is getting murdered, one is doing murdering, right? If you're the guy on the airplane flying into the One World Trade Center, you are saying to yourself, you know, God is God told me to do this. God is this pleases God. Me killing people. This pleases God. So thus I'm going to do this. Versus the Christian of I don't know who got beheaded. One of the disciples, maybe it was Paul. I don't really remember. A disciple that's getting beheaded. That's somebody else killing them, and they have the option because them dying isn't God calls us to die spiritually, but he doesn't say, "Oh, well, die and beheaded because this pleases me." Versus over here, they're saying, "Well, this is pleasing God," and over here, it's saying this doesn't please God, but I'm not going to denounce my faith, and they're getting murdering versus doing the murdering, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yes. How about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians in Waco, who gladly went to their deaths? We think most of them anyway. Or Jim Jones in Jonestown, also
Mm-hmm.
a Christian sect. Now we call these cults and dangerous cults, but they were Christians. I mean, Jim Jones was a very popular preacher in the San Francisco Bay Area. He came from Indiana, actually, where he was a popular preacher. And these people absolutely believed that Jesus died for their sins and so on, and they went to their deaths, believing this. And we now, in hindsight, go, well, that was a crazy cult. They should not have died, and those leaders were delusional. Okay, so how do you know that Jesus just wasn't like that, except not a crazy, dangerous cult, but
Well,
just a cult leader? He was innovator. He was better than the Old Testament morality, that's for sure. But we can do much better than that. And so ahead of his time, he got a gathering of followers that grew very, very slowly. I mean, just barely, like maybe 1% a year, until Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So it grew quickly then, but then it kind of went back to just maybe 1% growth rate a year. And there are only two ways to grow a religion: fecundity, you just have lots of babies, or missionary work.
yeah.
Well, Judaism doesn't have missionary work, right? So they don't grow their religion through missions, but Christians do.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, what I'm saying is that there's really nothing that needs explaining. I mean, not all the disciples were given this, we're going to chop your head off unless you denounce Jesus. Oh, I'm going to believe in Jesus anyway. Off goes the head. That's not actually what happened. And I recommend Bart Ehrman's work.
Bart Ehrman's
Yeah, Bart Ehrman, Ehrman.
E
Uh,
R M.
Ehrman, Bart Ehrman.
Awesome.
He's absolutely the best. His books, he's got teaching company courses, tons of
Mm-hmm.
videos online. He's books like How Jesus Became God, and the rise of Christianity and how it grew.
Mm-hmm.
There you would be well served to understand in detail the history of this. Now, Bart is not a Christian anymore. He went to Bible school.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, he went to, was it Wheaton? I think it was Wheaton College, and then he went to Princeton Theological after he got his PhD in theology.
Wow.
And the history of Christianity is his thing. But it's not. The story is really not at all like you're describing it. And so that argument sort of fails on those sorts of uh, counter examples. Anyone that goes to their death, well, then that must mean something. No, people do this all the time. It's not unusual. People die for all kinds of causes. I mean, communism and fascism were both pseudo religions. They were atheists, yes, sort of. Well, Nazis were Catholic, but just say that that it was communism was atheist. But communism was a kind of religion. I mean, it's not atheism driving it. It's ideology. People go to their
Yeah.
deaths believing in ideology all the time, and that's not a good argument for that particular religion. And then finally, I would ask you, um, since central to your belief is that Jesus actually lived, really died, was really dead for 3 days, so dead, not in a coma, not just chilled in the cave for 3 days and they brought him back to life and he went off with Mary Magdalene to France to start a family. If you want to go full Dan Brown, the Da Vinci Code. Um, no, that he was really dead and that he was really resurrected from the dead. Okay, that's what Christians believe.
Mhm.
Now, first of all, we know there's been about 100 billion people that have lived and died. Not one of them has come back from the dead. So this is a truly extraordinary claim. So how good is the evidence for this? Well, let's just ask Jews why they don't believe in Jesus as the
Which
Messiah.
I actually had a conversation with a rabbi here where I'm from of that, and he
Oh,
gave a pretty
good. What
good.
did he say? What did he
So
say?
he when I asked him, I said, well, um, I would say the three biggest monotheistic faiths, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, they all the differences. I mean, the main difference is who they see Christ to be. Christians, we believe he's Lord and Savior. Islam, they believe he's the prophet. Judaism, what do you see as Jesus was? And then he said, well, to us, he wasn't. I mean, we can't. He said we can't argue that he died or that he was a person, but we don't believe that he was a Messiah because of X, Y, and Z. Because our old scripture, the Torah, and the two other books, I never know how to pronounce it, but the three books that they have and the scripture that Christians claim point to Christ don't actually point to Christ, and they point to King David. They point to somebody else in the Old Testament. Thus, their Messiah is still yet to come. That's what he explained it as.
That's right. Yeah, that's correct. That's what Jews think. Yes, but my point is this: if your arguments for the resurrection of Jesus are so good, why don't Jews believe them? I mean, they believe in the same God that you believe in. They believe in the same book, actually. Well, at least the Old Testament. They just don't think the carpenter from Nazareth was the Messiah. So
Well, that's a
go ahead.
loaded question. That's a loaded question because, again, if I believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, then you could say the same thing about the rabbis at that time. Well, if you're Jewish and he was true, why didn't you just believe in him? So
Yeah. What's
I
your
guess
answer to
it's
that?
if every free will is a thing, and if everybody were to believe, I think that would contradict free will. So there's going to be some people that actually don't believe, and that's just kind of how it
Well,
is.
but
I'm
my,
sure there's a
my,
better.
my point, Jacob, is that if it was a kind of truth that could be proven, like here's my evidence and arguments, and this is why I think you should believe. If the arguments and evidence are so good, why don't these learned rabbis look at, or anybody, Jewish, any Jew? This isn't rocket science. I mean, it's like here's the arguments. They know your arguments. I know because I talked to them. Like Ben
Yeah,
Shapiro, I was on his show. Why aren't you a Christian? Oh, I'll tell you why. I just don't think the arguments and evidence is very good. Okay, I agree. So is it possible that you're wrong, that Jesus was not
100%. I'm
okay?
open to it. I'm open to it. That, again, I'm open to it 100%. This is why I really enjoy this conversation, and I enjoyed. I'm gonna continue to talking to, and it's crazy because not to undermine. I think God has a plan, not to undermine Christianity, but I've reached out to almost every Christian pastor down here. All of them said no. The only people that have been saying yes are imams, the rabbi I had last week, atheists. So I will never stop learning, and I'm open to it. I guess it's just a matter of coming to the truth and answering the questions that I have and answering the questions. That's what I believe. I don't know if that makes
Yeah, I
sense.
think yeah, it would do you well to do what I did, which is just read a lot. Just
Yep.
read what other people believe in other religions. Read about the history of religion, you read about the history of Christianity
Yeah.
by someone like Bart Ehrman. And now he has his critics. You can read those too,
Mm.
people who counter him. But then decide, right? I
Yeah.
mean, again, there's 8 billion people. There's 2 billion Christian, so 6 billion people are not Christian. About a little over a billion are Muslim. Just a few million, maybe 13, 14 million Jews. I mean, you can't base it on the numbers. So who has the better arguments? Or maybe that's not the way to do it at all. Maybe there is no correct answer. This is my approach, that it's not that kind of truth, that the Bible is not a book of history and science and so on. It's a work of literature. And you would not read Harry Potter books and go, well, is there really a place called Hogwarts? No, you're kind of missing the point. To ask if that's real. Is there really a train station where it's 9.5 or whatever that was? You're missing the point of the story. It's a story, a Jane Austen novel or a Shakespeare play. These are not real people. These are not real events. They're made up stories that carry a deeper kind of truth to them. So what makes great literature great is that it carries in the character and stories, which are all made up, deeper truths about the human condition, about human nature and love and lust and anger and jealousy and power and conflict resolution and all that stuff, everything. And those are true. Those are deeper truths about us, about human condition. And in my opinion, the Bible should be treated as that. It's a work of literature that has deep moral truths or mythical truths or something like that. But to treat it as a book of history where we have to test it and see if it's right or wrong, I think you're missing the point of the story. And I would say that applies to the resurrection story as well. To ask if Jesus was really dead for 3 days, he was really brought back to life, you're missing the point of the story. There's something else in there to get from that story. And so forget the did it happen or not angle.
Interesting. Now, I'm gonna sit on that. I like that. Do
this is
you
all in my this is all in my next book called Truth.
truth? Do you have a release date on that or no?
Yeah, about a year from now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll keep in contact because I will definitely love. I know you have to do marketing for the book, so I'll definitely love to recircle, maybe do
Yeah.
something in person as well.
Okay. Sounds good.
And last question before you head off. You probably have been asked this before, but what would it take for you to believe in God, in a higher being?
Yeah, it's a great question. I suppose some kind of appearance or something a little more direct than the arguments that I hear and that are not convincing to me. But even there, I'd have to be careful that I wasn't like hallucinating, or just in a trance state or having a epileptic seizure or something like that, because these things do affect people's judgments. So I'd want to make sure I was clear eyed about that. But I'm not sure that, again, back to my alien example, if we encountered a being who was essentially omniscient and omnipotent, at least compared to us, capable of generating new life forms through genetic engineering or even gigantic planetary scale levels of engineering, like creating what are called Dyson spheres, these gigantic solar panels in space to fuel a civilization to provide power from the sun and so on. This is all science fiction now, but it's quite doable. It just would take, just like thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years of technological development to do it. We'll get there eventually. But if another civilization did, how would I know that maybe that's God or it looks like God? How would I know? It's indistinguishable. Anyway, that's, so my answer is I don't know.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate you taking the time. I had a
All right,
very
Jacob.
good
Good
discussion.
luck
I
on
hope
your
that,
journey.
yes, and I
Yeah.
hope that a lot of people take from this. And again, thank you. And I hope that we could do something in the near future as well.
All right. Sounds good. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye bye.